Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the School of Taste and Tasting Around the World, session 5 of 6 in this webinar series. I am Nick Jackson. I'm very pleased to be with you here again today. If you're watching live, welcome. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to do that. If you're watching live, you know the drill by now. Please use the questions function to submit your questions and your comments to me throughout the course of the live webinar. And if you're watching on recording, then thank you very much for taking the time to do that. I know it's not always easy to make the live webinar, so thank you for doing that. We are up to a variety which is a favorite of mine and a favorite, I think, of many of us wine geeks, professionals, students of wine, but perhaps less popular with, unfortunately, with the international market, and that is Riesling. The reason why I wanted to put Riesling in this series of webinars about major varieties around the world is that Riesling is very famous for being a variety which expresses where it comes from very, very clearly. So I think it's a very interesting and enjoyable, in taste terms, exercise to study Riesling, different expressions of Riesling grown in different countries. So I'm looking forward to today's session. And then next week, we just have one more week left of this course. So we'll be looking at Syrah in that final session. So a bit of a change of temperature with that variety, of course, but I think these are two great varieties to go out on. Okay, so let me move forward to this slide, which you will remember from previous sessions. We are, of course, in this session today going to try and learn as much as possible about the identity of Riesling as a variety. And also about the places in which it expresses itself. But as always, I want you guys to keep in the back of your mind this question: what does this wine tell me about the region or the place? We can use this opportunity of studying Riesling also to learn about the regions in which it is grown as well. If, as people argue, Riesling is such a good vessel for the expression of place, we should learn something. There should be a story to be heard, to be attended to about the place, the origin for each wine. There probably, although not necessarily, there will probably be less winemaking to talk about in Riesling over and against, say, a variety like Cabernet or Chardonnay, where the winemaker has got many choices. Generally speaking, Riesling is a variety where winemakers try and allow the variety to speak very clearly for itself. So that brings me to my final point before we move on to the wines themselves. What should we be looking out for in a tasting of Riesling? Riesling, I suppose, is not an aromatic variety. It's not like Sauvignon Blanc or Viognier, but it's not neutral either. So I would call it a semi-aromatic variety with a whole range of different aromas and flavors that it can express depending on where it's grown and the climate. Anything from very light-bodied in cool climates to full-bodied in warmer climates, and we'll probably see that today. Certainly a wine that expresses a lot of fruit, usually, but also brilliantly capable of displaying more savory, dry notes, especially of this term minerality, however we can define that. And I think the best way of doing that is by looking at the wines themselves, but some kind of stoniness or some kind of expression of the soils in which it's grown. So Riesling often is a very good vehicle for that. And then perhaps most importantly, the thing about Riesling would be acidity. If there's any white wine which you could argue this wine is built on acidity, on a framework of acidity, it would be Riesling. Those people who taste with me regularly know that I contrast Chardonnay with its linear acid structure, where the acidity remains constant throughout the experience of the wine on the palate, and yet it draws the rest of the wine with it in a kind of purposeful movement to the finish. Riesling is almost the exact opposite. If Chardonnay is a horizontal wine with its sense of movement, Riesling is a vertical wine where the acidity is like a spine or a backbone or a stake which pins the rest of the wine in place, which ensures the wine feels a little bit even static on the palate. not much sense of movement, but the fruit and all the other elements of the wine seem to move around this backbone of acidity. So that's something to look out for across all the examples today. Okay, so without further ado, we should pour our first wine, which is going to be Germany, a German Riesling. The order we will taste today is the order advertised. We'll do Germany, Austria, Alsace, Australia. And we can talk about why that order at some point later today. Okay, so pour you please your German wine if you haven't done so already. I didn't tell you any particular region in Germany to choose. So why don't you tell me a little bit about the aromas and flavors that you're getting in your wine. And when you do that, please also do tell me which region it comes from so I can kind of make sense of your descriptions. My own example comes from the Rheingau, from the great Robert Weil estate in the Rheingau, where I visited last year for the second time. It's nice. It's a beautiful place to visit up there on the high point in the Rheingau region. Great wines and a beautiful old estate there. Amber, welcome. Amber has got a wine from the Nahe, from the most famous producer in the Nahe, Dönhoff, always a wonderful and very consistent producer offering brilliant value as well as quality, I think. Maria has got also the same winery as me, Robert Weil from the Rheingau. Maria, what exact wine do you have from them? She is saying tropical, mineral, stony minerality. I think, I was mentioning minerality at the beginning of this session, and I think if there's any of the 4 regions today that we're going to be tasting from that are going to be likely to express some kind of minerality, Germany might be the most obvious one. And as I've said before, if you do get some kind of stony element, some mineral element, then see whether you can qualify it further. Is it gravelly or slaty or granity, or what's the nature of the minerality if you can? Because I think mineral is such a kind of loose term now in wine, we have to be a bit more specific for it to mean anything. Okay, Tufi. Well, with Robert Weil today, he's got another one. Kiedrischer Greffenberg Trocken, 2012, interesting aged wine. Tufi as always has evidently got a cellar of mature wines. Lucky you, Tufi. Apple, ripe stone fruit, full-bodied, dry, very long and complex with some savoriness. So emphasis there in Tufi's notes on dry notes and with a dry finish, good. Neil is also with Dönhoff, lime, floral, wet stone, and pear notes, good. Nupa has got Clemens Bush, one of my favorite producers. Steely, citrus, a touch of honey, surprisingly ripe. What vintage is that, Nupa? Maybe it could be a vintage thing. Rodolfo has got an example from the Mosel, old vines. Yvonne has got an example from the Saar, a dry Saar wine. Saar obviously being a tributary of the Mosel, much to the very far west of the Mosel region, making some of the lightest wines in all of Germany. Yellow, green apple, quince, white flowers, grapefruit, stony, slaty mineral, almost salty. High acidity, light body, very precise. Light body, you see from the cool region, very precise. High acidity, sounds exactly right. Thank you, Yvonne. Dennis, 2016 Mosel, lime, pear, apple, wet rock, petrol. Good, sounds delicious. So Nupa's quite surprisingly ripe wine is from 2016. Okay, good. Jessica has also got a Dönhoff, apple, lime, wet stones. It is quite interesting, isn't it, that, I don't know how many of you have commented so far, like 15 or something, and about 5 of those 15 have got, or 6 have got 2 producers, which is a statement about how good those producers are, Weil and Dönhoff, but also a statement about the success of their distribution worldwide. We're in all sorts of different countries, and yet we all seem to be able to find those producers. So, of course, the best producers do get distributed more, but also it can be a function of distribution rather than of anything else, what you can find. Kirsten from the Pfalz, Basserman Jordan, an excellent producer in the Pfalz. Lime zest, green apple, jasmine, smoky white, peach, and pear. So Rodolfo's, it's got a funny description on his wine from the Mosel, Trocken Auslese. So some of you out there are sitting there thinking, how can it be trocken, i.e. dry, if it's an Auslese? Well, just a reminder that in the predicate system of sweetness, Cabernet being the least sweet to Auslese being the most sweet, that's a measure not of sweetness, but of must weight of concentration of the sugars. So it's up to the winemaker whether or not they want to ferment those wines to dryness or not. If you ferment a Auslese wine to dryness, yes, you have higher alcohol than you would, of course, if you left the sugar unfermented. So regular Auslese might be 7.5%. In Rodolfo's example, which is a fully dry example of Auslese, he's saying it's 11.5%. But Rodolfo's question is, shouldn't the alcohol be higher than that from fermenting all that sugar? Well, I guess it depends on how much sugar there was in there to start with, and to some extent on the kind of vintage it was, and the picking date, and all sorts of other factors. But yeah, I'm sure you could get 13% or even more Auslese Trocken. I mean, my own opinion is that I think that producers that are still using language like Auslese Trocken are behind the times these days. It's not permitted by the VDP, the group of leading estates in Germany. And I think it's not permitted precisely because they know writing Trocken in association with a predicate level is very confusing for the consumer. And I wish all estates, even if they're not members of the VDP, would go along with that. German wine labeling is difficult enough for the consumer. Let's not make it even more so. Okay, Anthony Karthäuserhof from the Ruwer like the Saar at the very end of the Mosel Valley in far western part of the Mosel. Trocken apple, white flower, peach, wet stones, delicate aromas wrapped around the high acid pole. So he's referring to the vertical steely backbone of acidity. Now, some of you have already made some comments about the style of the wine, which is great. If you haven't, while I'm just going through a couple of these bullet points on the slide, see whether you can sum up the style of your wine. Think about things like the body weight, the texture, the finish, whether the wine is really a fruity wine or a more savory wine. Especially you can think about the finish when you think about that one. What's the style of the wine, the profile of the wine, if you had to describe it to someone who had no idea what you were tasting? While you guys are doing that, let me just go through a couple of these bullet points. Once again, you know, Yvonne is saying, which I readily believe, that finding a Trocken wine, a dry German wine, was difficult in her market. And this is a cause, I must say, of frustration to me, because when you go to Germany, what people drink is Trocken. But what gets exported, especially to the traditional markets of the US and the UK, are the predicate wines. Now, I like the predicate wines just as much as the next person. But my own opinion is that we in those markets don't appreciate the Trocken wines enough, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to get you guys to focus on them today if possible, just so you could have experience of them. And not least because of the first point on this slide, which is just that these wines are becoming increasingly a rarity in Germany. Many of you know that when you go and visit a German wine producer, they will make you taste all the Trocken wines from the Ortswein and the Gutswein, like the village level wine, up to the Grosses Gewächs, if they're a member of the VDP. So up this kind of pyramid of quality in dry wines. And then they'll make you taste the exact same pyramid, but not of quality, but of must weight. So going up through the predicate levels. And of course, many producers, if you go to the middle of the Mosel, if you go to those very traditional producers like Prum and those other great estates in Grach and Valen, places like that. They're very cool sites, are sites which are going to require the retention of some sugar to balance out the extremely high acidity. So the predicate styles are very natural for those producers, fine. But my sneaking suspicion is when you go to regions outside the cool parts of the Saar and the Ruhr and the Mosel, when you go to the Nahe, and especially when you go to the warmer sites of the Rheingau, the Rhine-Hessen, the producers really want to be making dry wines. They'll never come out and say that to a visitor like me, because they know that in important export markets, those predicate wines are still very popular. But in my opinion, you just sort of prod them a bit, and they're actually really interested in the Trocken wines because they want their wines to compete with the great international white wines of the world. So I just wish that, you know, some study syllabuses for wine students mentioning no names, and some of the ways that we talk about German wines would be based more in reality about what producers produce and what people drink in Germany, as opposed to what we actually see on the export markets. But anyway, that's my rant. Okay, Anthony, elegant, engaging Karthäuserhof, this again from the Ruhr, so quite a cool region. Precise aromatics and refreshing attack balanced by delicate but ripe fruit. So all terms that speak of the coolness of the climate of the Ruhr. Maria, powerful, dry, acid, savory, steely aroma, and lots of acidity, good. The Nahe for Jessica, zesty, youthful, light-bodied wine again. A light spritz. Is anyone else getting a bit of spritz, a bit of dissolved carbon dioxide in that wine, which just gives a bit of freshness, a bit more attack to the wine? A medium length and a mineral finish. Sounds delicious. Neil, racy, taut, firm, structured, savory and mineral, supported by fruit with a long finish. Good. So quite a dry, savory wine by the sounds of it, Neil. Dennis, Grosses Gewächs, so the top dry wine of the German quality pyramid, dry, balanced, steely, firm, pronounced, medium body, clean and precise fruit. It's quite interesting, isn't it, that even the Grosses Gewächs, which is the most ripe, the most powerful sites, Dennis is saying that he only gets a medium body. You know, lest we forget, as maybe the second bullet point on this slide makes the point, we're in a cool part of Northern Europe for winemaking, especially you guys that are in the Mosel, Saar, Ruhr, only slightly warmer in the Nahe, so a similar style, and then a bit warmer again in Rhine-Hessen, Rheingau. The wines from the Pfalz and Baden, further south in Germany, a warmer climate, of course. Kirsten's Pfalz, ripe, fruity. It says Trocken, but in fact it is off dry. Yep, that can happen, Kirsten. Fruity start, lots of fruit at the start, but a savory finish, good. Yvonne, dry, lighter bodied, savory with slaty minerality, filigree texture. I love the word filigree, often crops up in my notes about German Riesling. What filigree means, for those who don't know in English, filigree is a very unusual word, but it means very intricate, complicated pattern almost of flavors and aromas. Racy, high acidity, very pure and precise. And Yvonne comments, you can taste every flavor. Yeah. I remember last week when we were talking about Pinot Noir, we had a conversation about German Pinot Noir being the red Riesling. And we were saying it was the red Riesling because you can taste every flavor in German Pinot Noir. But of course, being the Riesling, you can taste, this is the real Riesling. And yes, in the best German examples, precision and the ability to taste every flavor are hallmarks, I think, of the very best German wines, particularly in Trocken examples. Okay, excellent. What else do we need to tick off here? So we just did precision, purity of flavor. We've talked about acid. Trocken to TBA, TBA standing for, of course, Trocken beer and Auslese, the highest category of sweetness in German wines. So the point I'm just making is that, of course, as you guys know, you can make this variety in such a range of styles in this cool region. In cool vintages and cool regions like the Mosel, very hard to manage the acidity, so you're left with having to leave a bit of residual sugar to balance it out. That's the traditional origin of the predicate wines. In warmer regions, it's much easier to get a balance between concentration of fruit and acidity, so you can ferment to full dryness, have a wine at 12 or 13%, a standard table wine. And in the era of climate change, we're seeing those kind of wines being made much more readily and easily, even in cooler regions of the Mosel, Saar, Ruwer. The fact the VDP created this Grosses Gewächs category is a statement about how they feel they can make dry wines from these top sites every year in every major region in Germany. Minerality, I mentioned, Germany is always good for that. I've given a little bit of a sort of 101 of regions and things to look out for in the different regions for Riesling across Germany. I hope that the bullet points correspond at least somewhat to what you guys are tasting. Please tell me if they don't, or you've got some different impressions about the region that you're tasting. The bullet points go in order from a cooler region to a warmer one, and there are regions missing, but I think these are the 5 major ones. Mosel, I'm including Saar and Ruwer as well, as is now the standard for when we say Mosel. It includes those regions. So that's the lightest of all German wines, the most likely to have the predicate system in place. And so they can be almost just featherweight wines, but packed full of this intensity of flavor. We've talked in the past about the difference between concentration of fruit, which can be kind of density, mass of fruit, kind of weighing down the tongue. On the one hand, concentration of fruit, and intensity of flavor on the other hand. The Mosel to me is the most supreme example in the wine world of intensity of flavor as opposed to concentration. Yes, of course, there is some concentration, but because the wines are so light, it's impossible for there to be huge concentration. But what there is massive intensity of flavor, the piercing flavors and aromas of these Mosels, off-dry Mosels, and hopefully in your Trocken examples as well, is such a signature of the region. Anthony saying his Ruwer tastes like it's got residual, but wouldn't be enough to call it off-dry. How much residual sugar is likely? I mean, if it's not, if it's Trocken, a Grosses Gewächs level is limited to 9 grams and below. So if it's a top wine, it can have at most 9 grams per liter. I don't know whether there are laws about if it's stated Trocken from lower down the quality register, Anthony. I think that would be something where I would taste the wine and try and figure it out. I think at 9 grams for a very cool vintage where the acidity is very high, you may not feel those 9 grams hardly at all. They may feel like 3 or 4 grams. But in a warm vintage where there's already plenty of ripe fruit and you have 9 grams, then you taste it and you think, did they really need to leave 9 grams here? And that's a common complaint against a lot of Grosses Gewächs in Germany, which is that they could actually make them drier and they'd still be fine. But I'm not sure, Anthony, you'd have to tell me. See, Tuvi's asking a question about the Franken region, Franken or Franconia, where some of us, like me, had a Spätburgunder last week from that region. That's also a famous region. That's the region with the Bockstubel, those kind of bulb-shaped bottles. Those bulb-shaped bottles, often there are different varieties that go into those as well, not just Riesling. So I'm not sure that it's a Riesling region as a sort of monovarietal white grape in the same way as some of these other regions I've got on the slide are. That's the first thing I would say. Certainly, I would put Franken in the kind of category probably somewhere between Rheingau and Rheinhessen. So let me just walk up this intensity of ripeness. So you go from the Mosel to lighter. Nahe, to me, is very close to Mosel in style. The people who've got the Dernhoff examples, you will be able to see that, I hope, very similar to the Mosel. And if you had that glass in isolation, you might taste it and think that it was Mosel. But in fact, if you would have it next to a Mosel, you'd see there's just a bit more weight, a bit more structure, a bit more ripeness in Nahe, I think. Even though it is also walking that tightrope between the fruit or the sugar and the acidity, it's not quite so delicately balanced as in the Mosel. Rheingau, Rheingau is not a little step up from Nahe for me. To me, it's quite a big step up. To me, on those steep south-facing slopes above the Rhine, you get a lot of ripeness. You get a bigger structure, phenolic structure, a bigger acid structure, and you also get more texture, which is very important. The people who've got the Robert Weil, do you feel a bit of viscosity, just a touch, a little bit of oiliness perhaps? That's, I think, a key hallmark of Rheingau wines. So they don't have the absolute lacy purity of the Mosel and perhaps of the Nahe either. There's a bit more texture, there's a bit more body, there's a bit more structure, there's a bit more everything in the Rheingau, such that I saw someone saying that the Rheingau was like the Nahe the other day, and it's not for me at all. I mean, the regions face each other across the Rhine River, but they're quite dissimilar in terms of style, I believe. Now, the Rheinhessen, on this slide here, I could have put Rheinhessen before Rheingau in terms of maybe it's less ripe than Rheingau, but it depends on the producer and the exact location of the vineyards and things like that. But basically, the Rheinhessen is a sun trap, but in still a relatively north, cool region. And if there's one thing I would take away for you guys about Rheinhessen is that there's two distinct regions in the Rheinhessen. There's what you learn about in wine textbooks for your WSET qualifications, which go on about this thing called the Rote Hang Strip, which is this patch of red soils immediately above the Rhine River as the Rhine runs south to north before it turns the corner at the Rheingau region. On those very steep vineyards, which must be east facing, I guess, and then over the top, you get these deep red soils that make incredibly spicy wines of great character and personality. And in the old textbook, that is what the Rheinhessen is for quality wines. But in fact, what we've seen in recent years is a huge resurgence of producers making wines in the Rheinhessen about 15, 20 miles further south on what looks like quite boring, flat farmland, where you could be growing crops, but they've just decided to plant vineyards. And you would think, I speak for myself, that on this slightly flat soil, these flat terrain, the soils would just produce rather bland wines. But in fact, the soils are perfect limestone. And you may have heard of the producer Keller. He makes a wine called G-Max, which will sell at auction for over $1,000 a bottle. That comes from this region in the southern part of the Rheinhessen, around the town of Westhofen. And those can be intensely chalky, as befits the limestone soils. Only medium-bodied, but with great personality and structure. And then finally, Pfalz, just a much warmer, riper climate. I hope whoever had the Bassman Jordan taste that. These are sunny wines where the fruit comes easy. There's still plenty of acidity, but the fruits not such a struggle to achieve the ripeness that you would have in Mosel or Nahe, perhaps. Okay, I am required, by virtue of at least pretending to run a business, to mention that I am going to have a single dedicated webinar on Riesling in Germany on the 12th of November. It will be the first in my series of webinars about tasting wines from Europe. And I just want to do this webinar because I'm fascinated by it. I want to have 4 German regions in 4 different glasses at once and just taste across them. And I think it will be very eye-opening, very illuminating about different climates, styles, minerality, all that stuff. So if that interests you as much as it interests me, please join me on the 12th of November. Okay, any further questions about Germany? I could talk about Germany all day. It's a region I love, but we should keep on moving. So next we're going to taste, we're going to stay in a German-speaking world and move on to our Austrian wine. So please pour that, and let's do what we just did previously and talk a little bit about the aromas and flavors of your Austrian wine. And again, as you do that, please tell me which region you're in for your Austrian Riesling. I hope you guys didn't have too much of a difficulty finding Austrian Riesling. I know, of course, that for many of us, white wine in Austria is synonymous with a different grape, with Grüne Veltliner, but there's a ton of Riesling in Austria. It's really a huge production. And when you go and taste with producers, almost all producers, it seems to me, have both a Riesling and a Grüne Veltliner, multiple of them. So hopefully you guys didn't have any difficulty finding it. I don't really know why Riesling from Austria is never really referred to in the same sentence or the same breath as German Riesling or Alsace Riesling. It's a major source of Riesling in Europe, and the wines are fantastic. So I'm glad to try and put that right today by including it. Kirsten's saying it was hard for her to find the Austrian Riesling in the wine stores in the UK. I'm sorry to hear that, Kirsten, but I hope nonetheless you persevered, because I think the wines also for the UK market represent great value from Riesling. For people who don't appreciate Grüne Veltliner, which I know is quite a few people because I think it's a bit savory, a bit undemonstrative, I think there might be more personality actually in Austrian Riesling, more lifted, ripe, bright fruit, as opposed to the more savory profile of Grüne. So it could be an interesting contrast to that variety. Okay, Maria has got a wine from the Wachau, ginger, tropical, petrol, savory. So super interesting notes from Maria. Notes like ginger and tropical scream ripeness to me, but also then on the other hand of the balance is petrol notes and savory notes. So an interesting contrast there. Quite, if I would say so, quite a classic European dichotomy between fruit and savory. Michelle has got a Domaine Wachau. I've actually got a Domaine Wachau as well, so I'm interested to read Michelle's notes. Much more textured and phenolic, absolutely. Apricot, peach, lime, savory with stony minerality, and the acidity seems more integrated and balanced. I assume you mean more integrated and balanced than the German example. And I have a wine from the same producer, and I have to agree with all of that. I want to particularly draw out the emphasis Michelle makes on the textured phenolic aspect and the fact that the acidity seems more integrated, which could be a statement about the generosity of the fruit. So even if analytically there's the same grams per liter of acidity in the Austrian example as the German example, simply because there may be a bit more fruit, it seems like it's a bit better integrated. I'm just theorizing. Neil, from the Kamptal, from the 2019 vintage, I think 2018 in Austria, as in the rest of Europe, is a warm vintage. 2019, a bit more classic. I know a lot of people are very excited about 2019. If you are a buyer of German wines or Austrian wines, then I understand that 2019 is the vintage you're going to want. Pear, peach, quince, honeysuckle, lime. Good, sounds excellent. Nupa also in Wachau, chalky, lime, pear. So quite a few notes of lime and pear. I do think that those are quite consistent notes in Austria, not just for Riesling, but also for Grüne. Savory notes also for Nupa. Tufi, Brundelmeier, a classic producer from the Kamptal, 2015. Tangy, crisp, spicy mineral. Gosh, a lot going on by the sounds of it in that wine. Tufi. Jessica, Wachau, also tropical start with salty finish, and in the middle a rich medium body, but thicker than the German wine, Jessica says, so maybe more texture, richer, riper fruit perhaps also. Yvonne from the Kamptal, yellow apple, yellow peach, lemon, quite pure, Yvonne says, from the Kamptal, but broader than the German example. So I think we're beginning to get a few consistencies here, so we can talk through just a couple of points on this slide. So as you can see right at the top, I'm going to argue that Austrian examples, in general, ignoring the huge differences in climate and styles in both Germany and Austria, in general, if you're going to compare the two Austrian wines, I believe have got a little bit more body. Very simply, I think that they are riper. Certainly from the Wachau, which is a ripe region, but also from the Kamptal and the Kremstal. I think those regions are simply riper than the Mosel, the Nahe, probably the Rheinhessen, probably the Rheingau. Maybe of similar ripeness, however, to Pfalz and to Baden. if you go down there. So I think this thing about having a little bit more body is a question really about ripeness. You can see my Austria qualities, which would equally well apply to red wines and to Grüne Veltliner. Tangy acidity. I always talk about this in the context of Grüne Veltliner, but I think it also applies to Riesling. Tangy is not my word. I use it in the book, but actually I borrowed it from Jancis Robinson, and I think she's spot on. As a reminder, tangy means that the acidity almost seems to reverberate in the mouth. It's got its own sense of life and vibrancy. It's so thrilling and vibrant. It's tangy, resonates in the mouth, rings like a bell. I think that's for me what tangy means. And I find this tanginess in Austrian whites more than in any other wines that I can think of. Now, let's just look at my Austria Riesling qualities bullet points. Powerful, steely acidity, firmly structured. So what I want you guys to think about is a couple of you have mentioned that you find the acidity perhaps a bit more integrated. I don't know, whether you would still say the acidity was the same level as in Germany, which is probably going to be high for most regions, I think. I think we can probably agree that in spite of the additional ripeness and body and of the Austrian example, the acidity still remains high, tanginess. But here's my question. Could it also be that there's actually more acid structure? There's a more powerful structure there. We can say not just that the acidity remains high, but there's also more power in that acidity. It seems to give more structure to the wine than the German examples. What do you guys think? Do you find that in your glass if you compare the German and the Austrian examples? Let me just see a couple of your comments. Corinne, I've got a wine from the Traisental, very nice. Pear, white, peach, ginger, honey, petrol. Good, this weird combination of sweet and savory of honey and petrol is interesting, isn't it? Kirsten, yellow peach, pear, lime, savory guava with a savory finish. Nice. Shengli from the back out, a smaragd, so quite a high level of ripeness. Apricot, pineapple, lemon, sweet spices, musk, honey, stony minerality. I mean, again, I make this point a lot. You guys give such good descriptions of what you're tasting. But when you have such a diversity of flavors and aromas like the ones I just listed from Shengli, that in itself is a statement about complexity. That you can have this whole range of fruits from citrus to stone fruit to tropical fruit and something savory and mineral in the same nose or on the or tasting that on the palate. That's a great statement about the complexity of the wine. And I know we kind of take it for granted when we're dealing with these sort of classic European origins to find this this multitude of things going on at once, particularly in Riesling. But I got to tell you guys, there's many producers around the world who would die to be able to achieve that complexity so apparently effortlessly. It's a real virtue of these classic regions. Anthony saying the Hirsch has got moderate intensity aromas, less intensity than the Ruvat, and less precise. Interesting point from Anthony. I do think the flip side of additional ripeness in a wine is that you may lose a bit of precision. If you think about it, it makes sense. You have a cool climate, you have very precise, delicate flavors where you can taste every detail. You have a warmer climate, the flavors can smudge together a little bit. So they're all still there, but perhaps the ripeness of the fruit just blurs the outlines a little bit. A somewhat reductive note of lanolin, also for Anthony, higher concentration of ripe fruit. Good. So Anthony's making the point, remember I was drawing the contrast between concentration of fruit and intensity of flavor. Anthony's making the point here, there's more concentration of fruit, which again is a statement I think about ripeness. But one question for you, Anthony, is do you think it has a little less intensity or the same intensity? Can you have both increased concentration and increased intensity of flavor? Or perhaps the intensity falls off a little bit. I think that's what you're saying. Yvonne, let me just come back to your comment that you just made, Yvonne, because I will talk about that. Jessica makes the comment that Naha acid is like a dart, whereas the Wachau is like a powerful wave. Good, I like that. So Jessica's saying, I think that the like a dart means the acidity is quite precise and you feel it, whereas the Wachau is much more powerful and all-encompassing, more structure. Neil making a similar comment, the Dönhoff from the Nahe is more acid-driven, but the Kamptal is more about fruit with an acid backbone. Absolutely. So if I was going to go back one slide to the German slide, remember I was talking about the fact that German Riesling is really acid-driven. It's built on acid. And here we're having a funny, almost paradoxical conversation, because on the one hand, we're saying there's a firm, powerful acid structure, perhaps more so than the German examples. But on the other hand, the generosity of the fruit means that it's not such a standout feature of the wine as the acidity was in the German example. So a bit of a paradox there, but I think a true one. Chupi saying, in my wines, the acidity appears lesser in the Kamptal than in the Rheingau, but the Austrian wine is much more phenolic and drying. So it may only be apparently less acidic. So the Austrian wine is more phenolic and drying, says Tufi, and Yvonne says, in her example, there is more extract or dry matter. So Yvonne, I prefer to use the language of phenolics in white wines, but you and Tufi are both hitting the same point, that there is more phenolic content, I think, in the Austrian example. What do we mean? Reminder 101 about phenolics in white wine. The chewy, solid sensation that you get in white wines that feels a bit like the equivalent of tannins in red wine. This is essentially solid matter which comes from the skins of the grape, remains present in the wine, and along with acid structure, it provides a sense of structure and architecture in the mouth for any given wine. So other examples of white wines which have got considerable phenolic content, you would include Albarino, Assyrtiko, perhaps some white Bordeaux, wines like that. Wines where there's more than just acid structure. And I think one of the absolutely key things is, you can see under Austria Riesling qualities I've written, firmly structured and phenolic. So the firmly structured applies both to the acidity, like the wave of powerful acidity that Jessica was talking about, but also to the way that there's like considerable phenolic load in the wine, which contributes to that sense of structure also. So there's a lot of structure in the wine, and I think that's a key point of difference between the Austrian wine and the German wine. And once again, this is a statement about ripeness, thicker skins, more ripeness, more phenolics, more structure in the Austrian example. I've just given you a few little pointers there about the three major regions. Of course, there's many other regions in Austria that make a Riesling, but I think those are the sort of ones for, especially for quality wines. The Wachau is certainly the ripest. And then the Kamptal, to me, it would be it's the ripest. The Kamptal is the lightest, not to get those two confused. And I always think the Kremstal is somewhere in the middle. Okay, so I just think in the Austrian example, you might not have quite the absolute elegant finesse, the filigree detail and subtlety of the German examples, but you have more of everything else. You have more body, you have more phenolics, you have more powerful acidity, you have more ripeness, and along with ripeness always brings extra dimensions of flavor as well. So you're getting all those big long list of flavors that you guys were supplying. Makes perfect sense. These are very, some of these regions, especially in the Wachau, are very warm indeed, grown on slate and granite and these kind of hot rocks which reflect the light in the summer. These are some of the few irrigated vines in a major European region on these steep slopes in Austria. And so that's a statement about how warm that climate is. So the ripeness should be no surprise. What may be more of a surprise is the fact that the grapes do hold on to their acidity so well, but it's still Riesling. So maybe that's not such a surprise. Okay, so Catherine, we'll talk about Alsace when we get to Alsace, okay? Any other questions about Austria before we move on indeed to Alsace? I mean, I guess I hadn't, in my own sort of tasting, I hadn't done the direct comparison between Germany and Austria for a while. So I chose deliberately quite a big German example, a Grosses Gewächs from the Rheingau, a warm site, the top ripest vineyard. And I compare it to, in fact, a Riesling, which costs about half the price. So from Austria, so you would think it would be less structure, less power, less ripeness. But in fact, it's not comparable. I found there was to be so much more ripeness in the Austrian example. Okay, so talking about ripeness, let's move on to Alsace. We go to France. I did wonder whether to put these in a slightly different order and switch the order of Austria and Alsace, but I'm sure that this is the correct order because I think once more we're going to walk up the ripeness ladder. So tell me what you guys are tasting. Tell me what aromas and flavors you're getting. Tell me which wine you have. Many of them will just be labeled Alsace, which is perfect. If you have a Grand Cru wine, please state that. It's always interesting. I think what's quite interesting about this tasting is we're going to have quite a different style of wine. Very fragrant wine. Alsace is one of the great wine regions that I have not yet been to. I would love to go to. There's beautiful old medieval villages with the German influence as well, all the German names in Alsace. Beautiful wines. We've talked about other varieties from Alsace in passing, like Pinot Gris especially, but I think the Riesling really is the king of varieties in Alsace, at least in quality terms. People hold out a candle, of course, for great Gewürztraminer, great Pinot Gris, but I think Riesling can really hit the heights, at least for me. Amber's got a Rosacker Grand Cru. Fantastic, lucky you, Amber. Jessica is very excited to taste Alsace, aren't we all? Nothing like a bit of Alsace. We just need maybe some sausages and some mustard and some other pretty rich food, and then we'll be all set. Nupa has got ripe Bosque pear, peach, tangerine, whetstone. Good, sounds delicious. And let me taste my Alsace. I have a Weinbach. Weinbach, I think, is quite a sort of traditional style producer, usually making wines with quite a lot of generosity of fruit. Michelle, ripe fruit, peach, mango, red apple. The fruit wraps around the acidity, and also some lime zest. Jessica is also wanting to go to Alsace. Amber, lots of honeyed and ginger notes with the Grand Cru. And Amber commenting there could be some botrytis in here as well. Yeah, that's definitely possible. Late harvest fruit can easily develop botrytis. Toffee, peach, ripe apple, petrol, off dry, so a little bit of residual sugar in Toofy's example, some phenolics, good. For Dennis, dry, sweeter ripe pear, peach, river rock, lemon curd, lime zest. So again, another mention of this combination of citrus notes like lime along with stone fruit notes. I do think for some reason that stone fruit notes are quite typical for across the Alsatian varieties. I feel like that's quite a nice fruit profile, the stone fruits. We do know, of course, that we get the tropical fruits, but I wonder whether the citrus, like the lime and lemon that some people are getting, is really a statement perhaps more about the variety than the region. Those very fresh citrus notes. Usually Riesling has got at least some of those notes, perhaps as a reflection of the very high acidity. Meal, pear, peach, ginger, ginger notes just like amber, petrol, lime, white pepper, good. Yvonne, nectarine, quince, stone fruits, guava, tropical fruits, honey, sweetness, less pure and delineated aromas than the German and Austrian examples. So less purity of flavor, Yvonne is saying. Jessica's got Frederick Emil from Trimbach, which is a great wine. I encourage you, I think that's one of the great value, really super fine wines in the world. It's about $65 US a bottle. The wine starts singing at about 10 years of age and just improves from there. So I know that $65 isn't nothing, but to get complexity, all the glorious complexity of Riesling from Alsace, then that's a great buy. For that wine, Jessica is saying petrol, apple, peach, so deeply mineral and such tension and depth and length. And indeed, Jessica is saying it's a baby at 9 years old. I would say that Jessica's wine, the Cuvée Frederick Emil, is quite a dry, even austere expression of Alsace. Kirsten has got a Grand Cru from 2014. Ginger, again, the ginger note, I think you can find ginger across varieties in Alsace, but certainly a very Alsatian thing. Honey, ripe pear, peach, apple, lemon, some spice, yeah, and whetstone, good. Corin, much less ripe than the Austrian wine. Okay, good. Shengli, mushroom, forest floor, very savory actually from Shengli. Honey, beeswax, smoke, various spices, stewed stone fruits, tree fruit, bananas, high levels of stony minerality as well. I mean, once again, just the whole range of flavors testifying to the complexity of the wine. So my first point on this slide is with an exclamation point, wines that scream their origin. I mean by that you sort of put one nose in the glass and you're just taken to Alsace right away. I think the combination of the stone and the tropical fruits, that sweet spice, the ginger notes, perhaps some kind of minerality, perhaps some kind of petrol notes. Alsace just makes such fabulously perfumed wines, and the ripeness and the richness. You just put your nose in the glass, you know you're in Alsace. You may not yet know that you're in Riesling, but you know you're in Alsace for sure. But then when you do taste the wine, I believe that the acidity will take you right to Riesling before Pinot Gris, before Gewürztraminer. So very, when people talk about terroir expression of Riesling, this is another good example. Decisions about wine style, picking date. So this is a very important point. There's a whole range of styles of Alsace Riesling. A long-term benchmark for me was Trimbach's kind of entry-level Riesling, which you buy for $20 or even less, and it's like $17 or something. I'm sure if you buy it in Europe, it would be about 12, 13 euros. It's a totally delicious, steely, light to medium-bodied wine full of limey intensity. But in fact, that kind of very clipped, precise style, even though it's true to Trimbach house style, may not totally be typical of all the range of options that are available to the Alsace wine producer. And indeed, I would go so far as saying that it may be unusual in being that very clipped, bright style, because many producers like to include a bit more generosity of fruit, a bit more softness of fruit in the mid palate, overall a bit more ripeness. So for each domain, the date when you pick is going to be a hugely important decision in determining the wine style. Someone already mentioned botrytis. If you have botrytis, that's not only going to add aromatics, but it's also going to add more concentration, ripeness, and probably higher alcohol as well. Anthony's saying he's got a Rickeveer Riesling, presents an opposite fashion to the Camptal, higher aromatic intensity and complexity, but a restrained palate for the Alsace, versus a less aromatic but bigger flavor profile for the Camptal. So more aromatics and complexity for Alsace, but perhaps more flavor for Austria. Okay, good. Neil. Neil's making an overall point. Neil, great point, but I'm going to come back to that. Anthony, just clarify, greater fruit concentration in Camptal, but more austere, higher flavor intensity for Alsace. Okay, good. So France qualities, unchanging from, I don't change these according to variety, I just keep these the same. Now, in a way, I think Alsace would be a region which might stretch these France qualities to breaking point a little bit, because in the bigger, more exotic styles of Riesling from Alsace, the balance may not be quite there, because you may have such a big weight of body, you may have higher alcohol, you may have sweetness. But nonetheless, I do think in these wines, there is an effort to keep things in balance. So whether that's high acidity versus the ripeness of fruit, or whether it's the slightly dry, bitter phenolic content, also balancing out that sweetness of the ripe fruit, that can also be relevant. But look at how many points I make for the Alsace Riesling. There's so much to say about this wine style. This smoky and slaty nose, I think many of you have got that, some kind of mineral dimension. I often do get some kind of smokiness in Alsace wines in general. Phenolic grip. So we talked about phenolics before, but once again, phenolic grip, the chewiness, adding a sense of structure. But that can also, in Alsace examples, express itself with a slight bitterness on the finish. So that's an important component of the style. Once again, the bitterness on the finish is a balance to the ripeness or the generosity of the fruit up front. So it serves a very practical purpose. Lacks the purity of fruit. I think you're beginning to see this now, I hope, as we move between these different European regions. I think someone already commented on this, that if you have a Mosel or a Nahe example, crystalline purity and precision of fruit expression, then you go to Austria, where you get riper fruit, so it may not be quite so precise, but it's surely very bright and tangy, that we were talking about with the acidity. And then when you get to Alsace, I was talking about those smudging together of flavors, you get a lot more of that smudging, perhaps less precision, perhaps less purity of flavor, as you go from a warmer to a warmer to a warmer climate. Because Alsace, of course, it's warmer than almost all German wine regions, being in the shadow of the Vosges Mountains with these long autumns where virtually rain-free, so you can just leave the grapes hanging out there on the vine to achieve the wine style that you're looking for. And possibly as warm as, if not warmer than, the Austrian examples as well. So this is certainly, given where it is on a map, if you look where it's at on the map, a more riper wine style than you would expect for its rather northern latitude. If you consider that right across the border is Baden, yes, those are ripe Rieslings from Baden, I don't deny that, but many Alsace, probably most Alsace examples are riper, and in some cases a lot riper, especially the Grand Cru wines. Let me just finish this bullet point before I go to your comments. Can be off dry. Why? Think about it. Why would it be off dry? Because the ripeness is so much that if you fermented it to full dryness, you're going to have 15 or 16% alcohol. So you have a Grand Cru wine which has got a full body, a viscous texture, a ton of phenolics, but also a few grams of residual sugar. It's already 14%, but the winemaker probably sensibly doesn't want it to be 15%. So again, the fact that there's sugar in here is for the exact opposite reason to why there's sugar in the Mosel examples. Think about it. The sugar in the Mosel, because you've got to balance the acidity, which is just screamingly high. Here, you're retaining some sugar because you want to keep the alcohol down. In the Mosel, it's tough to make dry wines at 12, 13% because you just don't get that ripeness. Here, it's the opposite. High alcohol, full body. I think Alsace probably makes the fullest bodied Rieslings anywhere that I can think of. Maybe you guys have got some ideas, but full-bodied, richly textured, especially from Grand Cru sites and Grand Cru wines. Okay, so let's see what you guys are saying. Dennis, the phenolic grip from higher pressure or some skin contact. Certainly pressing, Dennis, but again, I just remind everyone that skin contact is a very amorphous and I think misunderstood term. People think that skin contact means skins in the fermentation vessel. Almost certainly not, not that, but skin contact more often means simply the time between when you pick the grapes off the vine, when you snip them off, and when you crush them. If you just leave those grapes as whole cluster grapes prior to crushing or pressing, then that counts as skin contact. And during that time, you can leach out some of the phenolics from the skins. So that to me is more standard skin contact. And that definitely happens. Producer by producer choice, of course. What I do know is that for my fellow Master of Wine at St. Humbrecht, they are obsessed with pressing. The pressing for them is absolutely an elemental part of wine quality in their region. There's a podcast about this subject if you're interested on, I'll drink to that, St. Humbrecht, and he talks in detail about why they press as carefully as they do, and a lot of it is because of this issue about retaining some phenolic matter. Yvonne, dry but not as bone dry as the Austrian example. Exactly. Piercing high acidity but with fleshier, riper fruit with a very chewy phenolic texture. Absolutely, perfect. Jessica's saying, only in Alsace could Riesling's high acidity be overshadowed by flavor. Exactly, or as someone else said, the acidity is more integrated into the fruit. So I don't think we are seeing a reduction in the level of acidity. I think in Germany, Austria, and Alsace, we still have high levels of acidity typical of Riesling. But I think the increased ripeness that we're seeing here just means that it stops being quite so obvious and quite so evident. And the additional thing about that ripeness of fruit is that you might also rely on additional phenolic content to contribute more attack, bite, freshness to compensate for the additional ripeness, sweetness, generosity of fruit. Are Alsatian winemakers more likely to use large used casks for aging and fermentation than German or Austrian winemakers? I think all of these winemakers use large casks. They certainly don't want to have any imprint of oak. Of course, there's a handful of producers in the southern part of Germany, in Pfalz and Baden, which do use some oak in their warmer climate. Maybe their wines can assume those flavors a little bit more. But in general, I think that these are all regions where large and old oak is the order of the day. One of the most fascinating things when you visit Germany is to talk to the wine producers about how they break in their new oak casks. The Fuder or the Stuck, depending on which region you're in, these huge casks, 1,000 liters or more. No, a lot more than that, 2,000 or 3,000 liters. And they will explain how they will not use it for Riesling until it's at least 7 years old. And so up to that time, they start off by putting water in it, just for however long, as soon as the barrel arrives. And they take the water out, and the water comes out brown, right? And then after the first year, they put a variety which is full of flavor in it, like Pinot Blanc is the common one in Germany. Many German winemakers make a Pinot Blanc, a Weissburgunder. They put that in there for the first year, and maybe they put the next vintage of Pinot Blanc in there. And then they might go to a slightly more delicate variety, like maybe a Pinot Gris. And then gradually, after all these years of going through these different varieties, which can take on those flavors a little bit more easily than Riesling can, then at last the oak is finally ready for Riesling. And then of course, they'll try and use that Fuder, that Stuck for 50 years or more. They have very careful cleaning protocols for the time when they remove the wine each year from those large pieces of oak. Do you know of any examples of Riesling with new oak? Yes. What's the name of that producer? In the Von Winning. Von Winning? Winning as in winning the game. Von Winning in the Pfalz uses new oak. Okay. Riesling in Alsace. Any more questions about Alsace? So I think we're finishing this section about Riesling in Europe. I hope that it was as illuminating for you as it was for me. I think in very simple terms, transition from less ripe to more ripe, a transition from less phenolics, less powerful acid structure and phenolic structure to more and more powerful. And what we didn't also talk about very much is more and more texture as we go along. A slight oily viscousness in Austria and a lot of that in Alsace. So, Catherine, to go back to your question, those I think are the key distinguishing features. But once again, and I say this every week, so I apologize, but this is a statement about climate. We're seeing very vividly a warming sites here, the expression of how these wines emerge from these warming sites. And when people use the word terroir, I think we all are naturally thinking about things like the soil type, especially the stoniness or the rocks which underlie the soils. But I think that climate is just as important a constituent factor of terroir as anywhere else. If we say that Riesling is a vehicle for terroir, we can very clearly see that Riesling is a vehicle for differences in climate, in the warmth of individual sites. And so to me, that is ultimately terroir. That's an absolutely fundamental part of terroir. So I love to taste that. Okay, so why don't we move outside of Europe now and go to Australia. A totally different world, I think, from what we've just been tasting, but maybe a good wine to finish on to cleanse and refresh our palates. So tell me what wines you guys managed to find, and indeed what you're tasting as you pour your Australian Rieslings into the glass. Thank you, Kirsten, for your prompt about font winning. Yes, and we were on the same page with that one. Okay, hold on. So Jessica is in the Adelaide Hills of Australia with the Egon Muller example. So Egon Muller, as you guys know, the great star of the Saar region, the main, although not exclusive owner of the Schatzhofberger Grosses Quebec site, one of the most celebrated sites for making the predicate wines in Germany. Egon Muller has got various other properties around the world. I think there's one in Slovakia, and Jessica has got the Australian one, so that'll be fun to taste. Tufi is in Clare Valley, bone dry, lime, white flowers, very slight petrol hint. Okay, good. Michelle, great southern region, very austere. Lime juice, green apple, steely. Amber has got one of my favorite all-time classics, as has Yvonne from Pusey Vale. This picture, by the way, is in fact Pusey Vale. Not a very demonstrative picture, I know. It was a kind of overcast day, as you can see, when I visited there in 2015. It was in mid-October, mid to late October, so the beginning of their, let me think about this, the beginning of their spring. So the very beginning of the growing season. Nupa, Great Western, lime and lime and lime. Nupa says chalk, quite taut. Good. Shengli has also got a Pusey Vale. That's a delicious wine from Eden Valley. Neil is in Great Western, slate, lime, pear, green apple, floral, high acid, very racy. Back to Naha levels of acidity, but perhaps even more austere. Good. And why don't you guys also go ahead and tell me about the style of your wine? You've just had 3 wines, which I think are all going to be quite different from this one. So maybe just draw out some of those differences for me. What stands out to you? Which wine is it most similar to? Which wine is it most different to? Maybe you've still got the Alsace in your head. How would you compare? Talk about the style of your Australian Riesling. Neil, yes, good. Kirsten was saying for the Clare Valley, lemon, lime, petrol, apples, grapefruit, white flour, very dry and steely. Very dry and steely, yeah, so I often talk about steely acidity in Riesling. I think that that's quite common in Australian examples as well. Dennis, Grosset Clare Valley, dry, more floral, more body, fruity, apple, pear, petrol, smoky mineral, lime. Each flavor can still be distinguished, but very well integrated. Good. That sounds very good. I do think that Grosset is a classic of Clare Valley, maybe a benchmark producer, I think, for that region. Corin, Clare Valley, also slaty, citrus lime, petrol, bracing acidity. Corin also comparing the acidity here to Germany, just like who was doing it before. But yeah, certainly back to that kind of, at least the intensity of the acidity of Germany. Likewise, Amber agrees that the Pewsey Vale is most similar to the Naha, but with a very chalky texture in Pewsey. Yeah, I forgot that about the Pewsey Vale. It's a wine I know quite well, but I've forgotten it's got quite a chalkiness to it. Leaves, excuse me, leaves a coating of texture on the tongue. Good, thank you, Amber. Dennis, very similar to Alsace, but completely missing the honey and ginger. Yeah, we talked about the honey and ginger notes. To me, are suddenly late harvest notes, possibly from botrytis rot, possibly just late harvest, but perhaps not quite as ripe, or at least not in that style. Sure. Tufi, pale, bone dry, a little austere, limey, floral, slight petrol, racy acidity, and a fresh finished with honeyed notes. Kirsten says this is more like the Mosel Riesling. The acid is the acidity and the restrained, rather ripe fruit, rather than the ripe fruit in Alsace, Australia, and Austria. Excuse me. This is a very common mistake, a verbal slip that all of us have made when we're talking about Riesling around the world. The fact that there are world-class examples both from Austria and from Australia is irritating, but there we go. But Kirsten making the point that I think many of you are making now, which is the most similar wine of the wines we've had today, comes from Germany, with the emphasis on the very clean expression, both of flavor, but also the absolute clarity of that steely acidity, how that comes through and how it's such a central component of the wine. Jessica is saying that, so her example from the Adelaide Hills, which may not be quite such a classic region of origin for Australia, but nonetheless, she says it could be an Eden Valley or Clare Valley on the nose, but the texture is richer, like a riper version of the Mosel or the Naha. It's very clean and not oily, but has richness, perhaps from lees aging, so a bit of contact there. We haven't really mentioned lees today, but if you want to add a bit of mid-palate texture, then you can leave the wine on the yeast, on the lees during aging. And I wondered whether that, in fact, has happened in my Austrian example. I found a bit of creaminess to the texture of my Austrian example, which made me wonder whether there was some lees aging or whether that's just the style of the wine. Okay, so let's just talk about the few bullet points I have here. You all be aware, and in fact, none of you guys even prompted me to talk yet about petrol in Riesling, so I can stay beautifully on track here by talking about where I want to talk about it, which is in Australia, because many of you have mentioned that you do get petrol aromas. I do think it's incredibly common in Australian examples. If you do meet an Australian winemaker, be very careful about how you talk about this subject. Many winemakers consider it a fault and will not be pleased if you take the care to notice it. You and I might find it a delicious, interesting, complex aroma, but they might see it as something which is taking away from the purity of fruit. So just be careful when you're having those conversations. But with that being said, I do think that of all the regions we've looked at today, I do find it more often in Australia than in other regions, although I find it across all the regions for Riesling. So what is it? It's from this flavor compound, aroma compound called TDN. TDN emerges in wine grapes and subsequently in must in regions where the weather has been either very hot or very sunny. Certainly, if grapes get sunburned and the skins shrivel in the sun, then that's a very likely cause of TDN. But you can also get it through things like drought from hot weather. And so you can imagine why perhaps it makes some kind of sense that in the warm climate of Australia, you might get more TDN, more petrol notes than you would in European examples. Now, we know that these notes also emerge more with bottle age. The TDN is always in a bottle if it's there, and it just emerges more with time. And so many of you who've been lucky enough to experience older Mosel Riesling, maybe from the 80s or the 90s, will remember that you probably got some petrol notes. But remember that if you are still drinking those wines in 2020, they probably come from good vintages, and that's why we still have them around. We drink up the bad vintages, the weak, unripe vintages earlier. But if it's a good vintage, that probably means it's a warm vintage. The 80s and 90s were not such a warm era as they are now, as we're in now. So if you have a warm vintage, that would have been a good thing in those days. Now in Germany, for instance, we're at a time when perhaps a cooler vintage is actually appreciated. But anyway, the point I'm making is that if you're tasting old Riesling from Europe, you probably are tasting it only because it came from a warm vintage. Therefore, it's more likely to show TDN and more petrol notes because that's more common in warm years. So just a point about that. Yeah, I'm just mentioning that even though Riesling is grown in many parts of Australia, in the west part in Adelaide Hills, as we've seen here, I do think that in terms of world-class quality, then in South Australia, in Eden and Clare is really where you want to be. Australia qualities, I think we've talked about this before. It's a classic fruit first, fruit purity country. And we've also, I not mentioned on there, but we've also talked, I remember when we were talking about Cabernet, we mentioned the fact that Australian winemakers are not afraid of varietal expression. So in Cabernet, that means leafiness, some green notes, which are not so popular in other wine producing regions for Cabernet. But it's also true for Riesling, that varietal expression is not a scary thing if you're a Riesling winemaker in Australia. And I think the form that takes is high, even searing acidity, perhaps even slightly austere. That's what the grape wants to give. The slight phenolic grip, I think many of you are getting. A couple of you have talked about texture. Yeah, just that overall sense of a wine that's built on acid. I mean, that's what Riesling is, and that's what the Australian examples show. Okay, let's just take a look at some of your comments. Nooper commenting that the difference is in the finish between Australia and Europe. In the Australian examples, the finish is quite fruit focused with a limey intensity. Absolutely, Nooper, I could not have said it better myself. I go on and on about this, I know, but I do think classic difference between European wines and New World wines is the focus on fruit in the New World. And I think in Australia, they do such a good job of capturing the purity of fruit all the way through to the finish. Tufi, how common is lees aging in Riesling as compared to Chardonnay? I think it is quite common, but just for instance, in Chardonnay, often you're using smaller oak vessels, right? You're using barriques and things like that, 225 liters. But if you're using huge foeders and struks and things like that, even if you have some yeast at the bottom, it's really not going to make that much big of a difference. And I think that the other thing about Riesling is that you don't want to do anything that could obscure the purity and clarity of that fruit expression. So even if you do have some yeast in your aging vat, you're not going to go around stirring it up all the time because you really want to maintain that limpid purity of flavor. Remember that Riesling is a variety, not always, but often can be bottled quite early because there's no mallow. So the wine is a finished wine, really, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere by Christmas. You might want to just let it hang out a little bit just to pull out some of the tartrates, but otherwise the wine is pretty much ready to go. And so you often see those young Rieslings on the market pretty early. So anyway, long story short, I think if there is any lees, it will have minimal effect on the final finish of the wine. I'm interested in that question with regard to Austria because I did think I got some lees in the Austrian examples, but not so much in the others. Shengli said, I've got some Clare Valley Rieslings, the distinct fresh tennis ball, slightly different from petrol. I assume it's from TDN or something else. It sounds like we're still in that kind of petrol kind of zone, Shengli, so I would think that's the same thing. Do Australian winemakers use mostly stainless steel? Absolutely, yes, great point. Thank you for bringing it up. You're going to see a lot less oak in Australia, really. Stainless steel is the order of the day. In that warmer climate, important to have excellent temperature control during both alcoholic fermentation and afterwards. Stainless steel is the way to go. And again, look at all the bullet points I've got here under Australia qualities: fruit lead, fruit purity, precision, etc., etc. You're going to achieve that more easily in stainless steel in a warmer climate like Australia. Shengli, what about mallow? No mallow in Riesling, wherever it's grown. The absolute acid structure, tension of Riesling acidity would be obscured if you went through mallow. So Riesling is a very easy variety, at least on that front, to understand. So I'm just making in the last bullet point on this slide, Clare can be a little firmer and more structured than Eden, which can be a bit softer. I mean, in very general terms, I mean, we're talking about very niche distinctions here, but I do think we had a conversation, some of us, about hardness on the finish of the wine. Remember where we had this conversation last week in the context of German Pinot Noir, and I was commenting that some of the finishes of those German wines can be quite hard, which to me means low pH. So consistently across all the wines today, we've experienced high acidity and probably quite low pH, because the intensity of that acidity feels pretty serious. Maybe a bit less so in the Alsace, maybe a slightly higher pH there, softer, riper fruit, warmer climate, that would be expected. But here, one of the really interesting things about the Australian examples is that from this warmer climate in Europe, you do in fact get what appears to be a very low pH, and I think it is a low pH, that very hard finish. If you taste the wine, just think about the finish and just feel how hard that finish is. Australian Rieslings, I believe, have got very low pH, which of course gives a sensation of freshness, perhaps, but a certain austerity, a certain dryness as well, which if there's any phenolic content in the wine, that can also exaggerate, which I believe that whoever's got the Grosset, is it you, Dennis? Those wines from the Clare Valley can be very austere. And I think that's a really statement about pH, as well as the very high, almost searing acidity in the wines. Whereas, so in Clare, I think that thing about the pH you feel particularly in Eden too, but I do think Eden in general is a slightly softer, more easygoing style. That's my 2 cents worth on those two very close but distinct regions. Okay, any final thoughts about Australian Riesling, or by itself or in the context of the previous wines we've tasted? Hopefully you can see what a difference a wine from outside of Europe makes. More emphasis on the purity and the clarity of fruit, but still we get that very powerful Riesling acid structure, the backbone of steely acidity, which tells us that we're very obviously in Riesling land. Okay. Michelle expressing her enthusiasm for dry Riesling. Yeah, I mean, that sort of brings me back to what I was, my rant earlier on about why people always go on about predicates. The predicates are beautiful wines. No one is disputing when you get that perfect balance between sugar and acidity, they're ethereal, really. But Trocken wines are so delicious that I have a soft spot for them. And to be honest with you, if you had got a predicate wine from Germany, you may have been able to taste things like the steeliness of the acidity even more readily than in the Trocken examples. But the fact that we can see all the behavior of terroir and of the variety through the Trocken examples makes me very happy, because it tells me that in Germany, for instance, Trocken will tell you just as much about the variety and about where it's grown as the predicates do. So why wouldn't you want to drink Trocken wine all the time? But that's just me. When I first started drinking wine, of course, I hated the Trocken wines. To me, they were too austere, they're too dry. But I think my palate is drying out now. moving away perhaps a little bit from those predicat wines. They have a place, but for a table wine, I still prefer a dry wine, but that's just me. Okay, so summing up, I mean, gosh, I don't think we've ever talked so much about acidity as we have today. It's just, I mean, Riesling and acidity go hand in hand. Look at all the variables. Obviously, because we've been dealing with Trocken wines today, we haven't had to talk so much about sweetness. But I think even in Germany, we're moving away from the sweet wines towards drier wines with a warming climate. In Janice Robinson's column in the Financial Times last weekend, she said that 2019, she literally said, could be the last vintage, the last great vintage for the predicat wines in Germany, because they need cooler vintages, and those vintages are just not coming around as readily as they used to. The future for Germany is Trocken. Ripeness, we often, talk about what fruit profile we have in regions and different wines, but we're making a point about ripeness of fruit overall. That's really what we're talking about. And ripeness is, of course, a story about climate. So it's a great thing to consider when you're tasting Riesling. What's the ripeness of this wine? Jessica is saying, I just noticed that she got the TDN, the petrol in the Alsace and Australian examples. So from the warmer climate examples, she found the TDN. Anthony asking, what's the best temperature? For Trocken wines, I still prefer them a little fresher, not certainly not room temperature, but not icy either, because then you lose the beautiful aromas. So I would say maybe about 14 degrees C, so that would be about 60 Fahrenheit, something like that. Tufi commenting on about how the Grosses Gewächs Rieslings, the top dry Rieslings, are among the world's greatest white wines, but are still relatively affordable. I totally agree with you, Tufi. The only qualification I have about those wines being among the greatest white wines of the world is that they age less long than you would think they would. When you visit Germany and the producers want to pull out an old Grosses Gewächs to show you about how wonderfully they age, last year I went, they were pulling out 2011s, 2012s, 2013s, not 2s and 3s and 4s. And honestly, those wines which were 8 or 10 years old, they felt fully mature to me. They were not oxidized, but they were not going to improve anything more. And so that's my only qualification about those Grosses Gewächs. There is no doubt, by the way, that the predicat wines, because sugar is a preservative, they can last longer than those Trocken wines, as much as I love the Trocken wines. Dennis just saying the general public does not understand Riesling, but it's a great wine for those of us who continue to move to acidity, to more freshness in our wines. I totally agree with that. So indeed, and that's my final point, Dennis, on this side, it's still Riesling, still a tough sell for those of us who are in the business of selling wine. Still a tough sell, but all the more for us. So, okay, let me wrap up there. I think we have one more session left, a super fun session on one of my great favorite red varieties, Syrah, which I'm sure you guys all love as well. So, same time next week for our final session in this series. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here today, and I will see you same time next week. Thank you, everyone.